The water filled her lungs as Abigail Jones thrashed desperately, her sodden skirts pulling her deeper into the well's murky depths. She hadn't meant to fall, had only leaned over to retrieve the locket that had slipped from her neck, but the crumbling stone edge had given way, plunging her into the icy water below. Her fingers clawed at the slick walls, finding no purchase as darkness began to cloud her vision. Xavier Lawrence heard the scream from across the ranch. Dropping the fence post he'd been securing and bolting toward the abandoned well. The new girl from Boston, the one with the fierce green eyes and copper-colored hair who'd arrived just last week to teach at Fairplay's schoolhouse, had wandered too close to the condemned water source. As he approached, her cries silenced, replaced by splashing and desperate gasping. "Miss Jones," he called, peering down into the darkness. A faint splash answered him. Without hesitation, Xavier shed his gun belt, leather vest, and boots. There wasn't time to fetch rope from the barn. He took a deep breath and jumped feet first into the narrow shaft. The cold shocked his system as he plunged into the water. His eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering from above, revealing Abigail's pale form sinking below him. With powerful strokes, Xavier dove deeper, wrapping an arm around her waist and kicking toward the surface. They broke through with a gasping splash, Abigail limp in his arms. Xavier treaded water, keeping her face above the surface as he assessed their situation. The well shaft rose 20 feet above them, its stone walls slick with moss and age. "Miss Jones," he said firmly, giving her a gentle shake. "Abigail, wake up." Water sputtered from her lips as she coughed violently, her eyes flying open in panic. Her fingers clutched desperately at his soaked shirt. "You're all right," Xavier assured her, his voice steady despite the cold seeping into his bones. "I've got you. But I need you to stay calm while I figure how to get us out of here." Her teeth chattered as she nodded, still clinging to him. I can't swim." "That's fine. I'm a strong swimmer." Xavier glanced up at the narrow opening above. "Someone will have heard your scream. Help will come." The May sun had begun its descent toward the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows across Fairplay. The once booming mining town had quieted in recent years, but ranching and the railroad kept it alive. Xavier had returned just 6 months ago after years driving cattle up from Texas, ready to settle on his family's land. He'd never expected to find himself at the bottom of a well with the new schoolteacher. "Thank you," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling with cold and fear. "You saved my life." Xavier shook his head. "We're not out yet, Miss Jones. Please call me Abigail." She attempted a smile despite her chattering teeth. "I think circumstances warrant the informality." A corner of Xavier's mouth lifted. "I reckon they do. I'm Xavier." "Xavier," she repeated softly. "The ranch hand from the Lawrence place." He nodded, surprised she knew of him. "We need to conserve energy. There are some footholds in the wall. I'm going to move us over there." With careful strokes, Xavier guided them to the wall where ancient bricks protruded slightly. He positioned Abigail so she could grip the stones while he supported her from below. "Hold tight," he instructed, watching her slender fingers grasp the slippery stone. "My ranch hand, Miguel, should be looking for me soon. When the fence work wasn't finished, he'll come searching." Abigail nodded, her wet hair plastered to her pale face. "I was foolish. The children mentioned an old wishing well and I wanted to see it. I dropped my locket." Her voice broke as she glanced down at the water. "Your locket, a gift from my mother before she passed. The only thing I have left of her." Tears mingled with the well water on her cheeks. Xavier's expression softened. "Once we're out, I'll find it for you." Time passed slowly as they clung to the wall, taking turns supporting each other when arms grew weary. Xavier told stories of cattle drives to distract Abigail from their predicament, while she shared tales of Boston and her journey west. The schoolhouse in Fairplay had offered her escape from a life mapped out by her aunt, a loveless marriage to a wealthy banker 30 years her senior. "I wanted adventure," she said with a weak laugh. "I suppose I found it. Not the kind you were hoping for, I'd wager." As the light above dimmed, Xavier grew concerned. Their bodies were chilled, fingers numbing from the cold water. Finally, a voice called from above. "Xavier, you down there?" "Miguel," Xavier shouted back, relief flooding through him. "We're here. The schoolteacher fell in. I need rope. Dios mio, hold on." Xavier turned to Abigail, whose lips had taken on a bluish tint. "Help's here, just a little longer." Within minutes, a rope descended into the well. Xavier secured it around Abigail's waist, instructing her to hold tight as Miguel and others pulled from above. She ascended slowly, water streaming from her sodden dress. "Don't you dare die down there," she called back to him once she neared the top, her voice stronger than he expected. Xavier chuckled, the sound echoing in the stone chamber. "Wouldn't dream of it, Miss Jones." After Abigail was safely extracted, the rope returned for Xavier. His muscles burned as he climbed, using the wall for leverage where possible. Hands reached for him as he neared the top, pulling him onto solid ground where he collapsed, breathing heavily. Sheriff Thomas Burke stood over him, frowning beneath his silver mustache. "Lawrence, you fool, could have lost both of you." Xavier pushed himself up on his elbows. "Couldn't let the lady drown, Sheriff." His eyes found Abigail, wrapped in a wool blanket and being tended to by Mrs. Peterson from the general store. Her gaze met his, filled with gratitude that struck him like a physical force. "My locket," she said softly. "It's still down there." Xavier climbed to his feet, ignoring the protests of his body. "I made a promise." "Boy, you ain't going back in that well," Sheriff Burke growled. "That's a death wish." Xavier tied the rope around his waist. "Lower me just enough to search the bottom. That locket means everything to her." The sheriff muttered curses but eventually relented, organizing men to hold the rope as Xavier was lowered once more into the well. The water felt even colder the second time, but Xavier was determined. He took a deep breath and dove beneath the surface, fingers searching the silty bottom. After 3 attempts, his hand closed around a small metal object. Victory surged through him as he resurfaced, clutching the locket. When he emerged from the well for the second time, a small crowd had gathered. Xavier approached Abigail, still dripping, and placed the locket in her palm. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know how to repay you." "No need," Xavier replied, suddenly conscious of his soaked appearance and the eyes watching them. "Anyone would have done the same, Doctor." Williams insisted on examining them both for pneumonia or worse, ordering them to the physician's office nearby. As they walked, supported by helpful townspeople, Abigail leaned closer to Xavier. "Not anyone would have jumped into a well for a stranger," she said quietly. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Lawrence." Xavier's mouth curved into a half-smile. "Most folks would agree it's the latter." Despite Dr. Williams' concern, neither developed serious illness from their well ordeal, though Abigail was instructed to rest for several days. Word spread quickly through Fairplay about the daring rescue, transforming Xavier from a quiet rancher into something of a local hero, a designation that made him profoundly uncomfortable. 3 days later, Xavier rode his bay gelding into town, a bouquet of wildflowers tied to his saddle. He told himself he was simply checking on Miss Jones' recovery, a courtesy any gentleman would extend. The fluttering in his stomach suggested other motives. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a modest wooden structure with a bell tower. Classes had resumed, and Xavier timed his arrival for the final bell. He waited at a respectful distance as children spilled from the building, casting curious glances his way. Abigail appeared in the doorway, her copper hair neatly pinned, wearing a simple blue dress. When she spotted him, a smile transformed her face, making Xavier momentarily forget his rehearsed greeting. "Mr. Lawrence," she called, approaching with a slight limp, a reminder of their ordeal. "What brings you to town?" Xavier dismounted, suddenly feeling foolish with the wildflowers in hand. "Thought I'd see how you're faring, Miss Jones." "Much improved, thanks to you." Her eyes fell to the flowers. "Are those for me?" He nodded, presenting them with less grace than intended. "Nothing fancy, just some prairie flowers. They're beautiful." Abigail accepted them, her fingers brushing his. "Would you care to walk with me? I was heading to the boarding house." They strolled side by side down Fairplay's Main Street, drawing curious glances from townspeople. Xavier was acutely aware of Abigail's presence beside him, the faint lavender scent that somehow remained despite their dunking in the well, the graceful way she moved despite her injury. "The children have made you into quite the hero," she said, amusement in her voice. "Little Tommy Harris even drew a picture of you diving into the well. He gave you muscles the size of beer barrels." Xavier chuckled. "Not quite accurate." "No," Abigail agreed, her eyes briefly meeting his before darting away. "Though you were certainly strong enough when it counted." At the boarding house steps, Xavier removed his hat, suddenly reluctant to leave. "Miss Jones, Abigail," she corrected gently. "Abigail," he amended, the name feeling right on his tongue. "I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you to the Founders' Day dance next Saturday." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a terrible moment Xavier thought she would refuse. "I'd like that very much," she answered instead, a becoming blush coloring her cheeks. Xavier couldn't contain his smile. "I'll call for you at 7 then." As he rode back to the Lawrence ranch, Xavier felt lighter than he had in years. Something had shifted between them in that well, a connection forged in crisis that continued to draw him toward the schoolteacher. The following Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures perfect for the annual celebration. Xavier spent more time than usual preparing, bathing in the metal tub and donning his best shirt, one his mother had ordered from Denver before her passing 2 years prior. Miguel watched with undisguised amusement as Xavier struggled with his string tie. "Never seen you so worked up over a woman before," the ranch hand commented. "She's different," Xavier replied simply, unable to articulate exactly how or why. The Lawrence Ranch sat on 500 acres south of Fairplay. The modest main house, overlooking South Park Valley, with the magnificent Mosquito Range rising to the west. Xavier's father had claimed the land after the Civil War, building a cattle operation that prospered until his death 3 years ago. Now it fell to Xavier, the only son, to maintain the family legacy. He arrived at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house precisely at 7, hat in hand and nerves jumping in his stomach like startled quail. When Abigail descended the stairs in a forest green dress that matched her eyes, Xavier forgot to breathe. "You look beautiful," he said, the words inadequate for the vision before him. Her smile was worth every moment of anticipation. "You clean up rather well yourself, Cowboy." The town hall had been transformed with lanterns and bunting, a small band playing lively tunes in the corner. Couples twirled across the wooden floor while others mingled around punch bowls and tables laden with food. Xavier was not much for dancing, but for Abigail, he made an exception. Her hand felt right in his as he guided her through a waltz, his father's lessons coming back despite years of disuse. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Lawrence," she said as they moved across the floor. "I didn't expect such grace from a cattleman." My mother insisted I learn, said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo. Abigail laughed, the sound warming Xavier more than any whiskey. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Between dances, they shared punch and conversation. Xavier introduced Abigail to ranchers and merchants he'd known his entire life, proud of the way she engaged each person with genuine interest. She belonged here, he realized, not just in fair play, but at his side. As the evening progressed, Xavier suggested a walk to escape the crowded hall. They strolled beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, the spring air carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. "Thank you for tonight," Abigail said as they reached a bench in the small town square. "I haven't enjoyed myself this much since arriving in Colorado." Xavier sat beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Does Fairplay feel like home yet?" She considered the question, tilting her face toward the star-filled sky. "More each day. Boston seems like another life now. And your aunt, does she write?" "To remind me of my foolishness in rejecting Mr. Blackwell's proposal." Abigail's mouth twisted. "She cannot understand why I choose teaching children in a frontier town over marriage to a respectable man." Xavier studied her profile, silvered by moonlight. "What would make you stay?" "In Fairplay, I mean." She turned to him, something vulnerable in her expression. "Purpose, connection, the feeling that I'm where I'm meant to be." The moment stretched between them, fragile and pregnant with possibility. Xavier's hand moved to cover hers on the bench. "I believe you're exactly where you're supposed to be," he said softly. When he walked her back to the boarding house, Xavier gathered his courage at the bottom step. "May I call on you again?" Abigail's smile was answer enough, but her words made his heart soar. "I would be disappointed if you didn't." Spring blossomed into summer as Xavier and Abigail's courtship continued. Each Sunday after church, Xavier would escort her on rides through the valley, picnics beside mountain streams, or simply walks through town. They discovered shared passions for literature and history, spending hours discussing books they'd both read. The townsfolk watched their romance with approval and no small amount of satisfaction. The Lawrence ranch needed a woman's touch, many observed, and the schoolteacher needed a good man to settle with. One August evening, Xavier invited Abigail to the ranch for dinner. He'd spent days preparing, cleaning the house to his mother's standards, planning a menu of Abigail's favorite foods, even cutting fresh flowers for the table. "You've gone soft," Miguel teased as Xavier fussed with the tablecloth. The fearsome trail boss, worried about doilies. Xavier threw a dish towel at him. "Make yourself useful and check on the roast." When Abigail arrived, Xavier showed her around the property, pride evident in his voice as he described improvements and future plans. The house was modest but solid, 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a front porch that offered spectacular views of the mountains. "It's wonderful," Abigail said sincerely as they completed the tour. "I can feel the history here, the generations of Lawrences who made this their home." Xavier paused, heart pounding. "I hope there will be more generations to come." Something shifted in Abigail's expression, understanding, perhaps, or anticipation. But Xavier didn't press further. The timing wasn't right yet. Over dinner, they discussed the upcoming school year and the ranch's prospects. Afterward, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I never thought I'd find this," Abigail said softly. "Find what? Peace. Purpose." She turned to him, firelight from the nearby lantern dancing in her eyes. "You." Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "That day at the well, I didn't just save you, Abigail. You saved me too," her brow furrowed. "How so?" "I came back to Fairplay out of duty." The ranch needed tending after my father passed, but I wasn't living, just existing. Xavier's voice roughened with emotion. Then you fell into that well, and suddenly I had something worth diving after. Abigail's free hand reached to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. Xavier Lawrence, that might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. The kiss that followed was inevitable, as natural as breathing. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to increase the distance between them. "I love you, Abigail Jones," he whispered. "I think I've loved you since I pulled you from that well." Tears glistened in her eyes. "And I love you, my brave, foolish cowboy." As autumn painted the aspen groves gold, Xavier knew it was time. He visited the bank, withdrawing his mother's ring from the safe deposit box, and rode into the mountains to gather his thoughts. The ring was a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing ostentatious, but given with his father's whole heart. On a crisp October Saturday, Xavier invited Abigail to ride to his favorite spot, a meadow overlooking South Park Valley with views clear to the Continental Divide. They spread a blanket beneath a golden aspen, sharing a lunch of bread, cheese, and apple pie. "I've been thinking," Xavier began, his usual confidence wavering. Abigail smiled encouragingly. "A dangerous pastime, indeed." He took a deep breath. "When I jumped into that well after you, I didn't think about the danger. I just knew I had to reach you." He shifted to face her fully. "Every day since then, I've felt the same pull toward you. Like you're the center of my world, and I can't help but be drawn to you." Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes as Xavier reached into his pocket. "Abigail Jones, I want to build a life with you, here on this land in this town." He opened his hand to reveal the ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Xavier, yes." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her finger. When Xavier kissed her, he poured 5 months of growing love into the embrace. "When?" he asked when they finally parted. "When will you become Mrs. Lawrence?" Abigail considered. "The school term ends in December. How about Christmas week? A winter wedding?" Xavier would have married her that very moment if possible, but he nodded agreement. "Christmas week it is." News of their engagement spread through Fairplay faster than wildfire. Congratulations poured in from every direction, along with offers of help with wedding preparations. Mrs. Peterson insisted on organizing a sewing circle to create Abigail's wedding dress. Sheriff Burke volunteered the use of his sleigh for transportation if snow arrived as expected. Even Dr. Williams, normally gruff and practical, presented them with a handcrafted quilt for their marriage bed. As the wedding date approached, Xavier threw himself into preparations at the ranch house. He repainted the master bedroom, ordered new furniture from Denver, and expanded the garden plot at Abigail's request. Every improvement was made with their future in mind: children playing in the yard, family gatherings around the dining table, quiet evenings on the porch watching sunsets together. December arrived with gentle snowfalls that transformed Fairplay into a winter wonderland. The wedding was set for December 23rd, allowing for a brief honeymoon before the new year began. On the morning of their wedding day, Xavier stood in the church dressing room, adjusting his tie for the 20th time. His best man, Samuel Carter, a childhood friend who'd stuck by him through trail drives and hard times, slapped his shoulder. "Stop fidgeting. You look fine." "What if she changes her mind?" Xavier voiced his deepest fear. Samuel laughed. "The woman who looks at you like you hung the moon, not likely." Xavier wasn't convinced. She could have any man she wanted. Why settle for a rough cattleman with calloused hands and a weathered face? "Because she loves you, you idiot." Samuel straightened Xavier's tie one final time. "Now pull yourself together. You've got a bride waiting." The Fairplay Church had been transformed with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and countless candles. Every pew was filled with townsfolk and neighboring ranchers. Xavier took his place at the altar, heart pounding so loudly he was certain the front row could hear it. When the piano began Mendelssohn's Wedding March, the congregation rose. Xavier turned toward the doors, and his breath caught in his throat. Abigail stood framed in the doorway, radiant in a white satin gown with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves. Her copper hair was arranged in an elegant updo beneath a short veil, and she carried a bouquet of winter roses. Without family to give her away, Sheriff Burke, who had become something of a father figure to her, escorted her down the aisle. Xavier couldn't take his eyes off her as she approached. When Sheriff Burke placed her hand in his, Xavier felt something settle within him, a certainty that transcended nerves or doubt. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Xavier scarcely heard the words. He was lost in Abigail's eyes, in the promise they held. They exchanged simple vows, voices clear despite the emotion behind them. Xavier's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the gold band onto Abigail's finger to join her engagement ring. When she placed his matching band on his finger, he felt the weight of commitment and joy in equal measure. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "Mr. Lawrence, you may kiss your bride." Xavier lifted Abigail's veil and leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that sealed their promise before God and community. The church erupted in applause as they turned to face their friends as husband and wife. The reception at the town hall lasted well into the evening. They danced, shared cake, and received endless well wishes from the community that had watched their love story unfold. As midnight approached, they slipped away to Sheriff Burke's sleigh, which would carry them to the ranch, their home. Snow fell gently as the sleigh glided through the moonlit landscape. Abigail nestled against Xavier beneath thick fur blankets, her head on his shoulder. "Mrs. Lawrence," he said softly, testing the name. She looked up at him, happiness radiating from her face. "I quite like the sound of that, as do I." Xavier dropped a kiss on her forehead. "Welcome home, my love." Their first months of marriage were a beautiful adjustment, learning each other's habits, preferences, and rhythms. Xavier discovered that Abigail couldn't function before her morning coffee, while she learned that he sang off-key while doing chores. They shared the work of the ranch, with Abigail continuing to teach while Xavier managed the cattle operation. Spring brought change as Abigail approached Xavier one evening as he sat on the porch, account books in his lap. "I have news," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Xavier looked up, immediately concerned by her tone. "Is everything all right?" A smile bloomed on her face as she took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Joy exploded in Xavier's chest as he lifted her into his arms, spinning her around the porch. "A baby when?" "November, Dr. Williams thinks." Xavier gently set her down, suddenly worried. "Should you be teaching?" "Is it safe?" Abigail laughed, placing a hand on his cheek. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, my love. I'll finish the school term in June, then have months to prepare before the baby arrives." As Abigail's body changed with their growing child, Xavier found himself falling even deeper in love with her. He built a cradle from pine harvested on their land, carving intricate designs into the headboard, aspen leaves, mountains, and stars to represent their Colorado home. Abigail prepared the nursery in the room adjacent to theirs, sewing tiny garments and quilting a blanket during the hot summer months. They debated names, agreeing on Thomas Xavier for a boy, after Xavier's father, or Elizabeth Margaret for a girl, honoring both their mothers. The pregnancy progressed normally until late October when Abigail began experiencing concerning pains. Dr. Williams ordered bed rest, his expression grave as he spoke privately to Xavier. "The baby is positioned oddly. If it doesn't shift, we could face complications." Xavier spent sleepless nights praying, remembering another time he'd felt this helpless watching Abigail sinking in the well. But this time, he couldn't simply dive in after her. This battle she had to fight largely alone. On November 12, 1883, Abigail's labor began in earnest. Xavier sent Miguel racing for Dr. Williams while he held his wife's hand through contractions that left her gasping. "I'm scared," she admitted between pains, her face pale with exertion. Xavier pressed his forehead to hers. "You are the strongest person I know, Abigail Lawrence. You crossed a continent alone to build a new life. You survived a well that should have claimed you. You can do this." For 18 hours, Abigail labored. Xavier was banished to the hallway when things grew critical, pacing the floorboards until they creaked in protest. When a baby's cry finally pierced the silence, he froze, heart in his throat. Dr. Williams emerged, exhaustion evident in his stooped shoulders. "You have a son, Lawrence. Strong lungs on that boy." "And Abigail?" Xavier demanded. The doctor's face softened. "Tired but well. She's asking for you." Xavier found his wife propped against pillows, hair damp with sweat, cradling a small bundle wrapped in the quilt she'd made. When she looked up, the love in her eyes stole his breath. "Meet your son," she whispered. "Thomas Xavier Lawrence." Xavier sat carefully on the bed's edge, gently taking the bundle. His son's face was red and wrinkled, a shock of dark hair plastered to his tiny head. As Xavier watched, the baby's eyes opened, seeming to focus on his father's face. "Hello, Thomas," Xavier said, voice rough with emotion. "I've been waiting to meet you." He looked at Abigail, overwhelmed by love for the family they'd created. "Thank you." She reached for his hand. "For what?" "For falling into that well." Abigail's laugh was tired but genuine. "I hope that's not how we'll tell him the story of how we met." "Oh, but it's the best part," Xavier insisted, gently returning their son to her arms. "How could I leave out the moment that changed everything?" The years that followed brought both joy and hardship. Their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, born 2 years after Thomas. The ranch prospered despite occasional drought and harsh winters. Xavier expanded their holdings, while Abigail eventually became the school principal, implementing progressive teaching methods that earned Fair Play's school regional recognition. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's height and his mother's intelligence, while Sarah inherited Xavier's adventurous spirit and Abigail's copper hair. Both children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, balanced with the discipline of education their mother insisted upon. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Abigail with a journey to Denver, where they attended the opera and stayed in the elegant Brown Palace Hotel. As they prepared for the evening, Xavier presented her with a gift, a new locket to replace the one that had started their story. "Open it," he urged. Inside were tiny portraits of Thomas and Sarah on one side, and on the other, a miniature sketch of the old well where they'd met. "So you never forget where our journey began," Xavier said. Abigail's eyes misted as she fastened it around her neck. "As if I could ever forget the day a handsome cowboy jumped into a well after me." Xavier pulled her close. "Best decision I ever made." That night, as they stood on their hotel balcony overlooking the growing city, Abigail leaned back against Xavier's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. "Are you happy?" he asked, his breath warming her ear. "With the life we've built," Abigail turned in his embrace, studying the face that had grown more dear to her with each passing year. The boyish cowboy had become a distinguished rancher, silver threading through his dark hair, laugh lines deepening around his eyes that still looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she replied truthfully. "When I left Boston, I was running away from a life I didn't want. I never expected to find everything I needed at the bottom of a well in Fairplay." Xavier's smile was tender as he traced the line of her jaw with his finger. "We should visit that old well, leave flowers or something." "It's probably filled in by now," Abigail mused. "Sheriff Burke was talking about covering it after our accident. Then we'll find where it was and plant a tree." Xavier kissed her forehead. A living reminder. They never did find the exact location of the well. Progress had changed the landscape too much over the decades. But the story became family legend, retold at gatherings and celebrations, embellished slightly with each telling. In 1919, on their 36th wedding anniversary, Xavier and Abigail sat on their porch swing, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. At 66, Xavier's hair had turned completely white, while Abigail's copper had faded to a soft silver. Their hands remained intertwined, a habit neither had ever broken. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gone to look at that well that day?" Xavier asked, his voice roughened by age. Abigail considered the question. "I believe we would have found each other somehow. Perhaps at the Founders' Day dance or through the school." Xavier shook his head. "I was too shy to approach you otherwise, needed the excuse of saving your life." She laughed, the sound as delightful to him now as it had been decades ago. "Then I'm grateful for my clumsiness and that broken well edge." Young Thomas Lawrence Roman III, their oldest grandchild, ran up to the porch, his 7-year-old face alight with excitement. "Grandpa, tell us the well story again." The other grandchildren quickly gathered, sitting cross-legged on the porch boards, faces upturned with anticipation. They'd heard the tale countless times but never tired of it. Xavier winked at Abigail before beginning. "It was a spring day in 1883. I was mending fences when I heard the most terrible scream." As he recounted their beginning, Abigail watched the man she'd loved for nearly 4 decades. Life had not always been easy. They'd weathered droughts, economic downturns, and the heartache of a stillborn son between Thomas and Sarah. Yet through it all, Xavier had remained her rock, just as he had been in that well, keeping her afloat when she might have drowned. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in the same room where they'd spent their first night as husband and wife, Xavier pulled Abigail close. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About time," she replied. "How quickly it passes, yet how full it can be." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We've been blessed. We have." Abigail touched his face, memorizing features she knew better than her own. "Promise me something, anything. In whatever comes next, another life, heaven, whatever awaits us, promise you'll find me again." Xavier's eyes grew serious. "I will always find you, Abigail, always jump in after you." She smiled, satisfied with his answer. "I'll hold you to that, cowboy." In the years that followed, their love story became woven into the fabric of Fairplay's history. When Xavier passed peacefully in his sleep at 79, the entire town mourned alongside Abigail. She continued for another 5 years, running the ranch with Thomas's help until her own health began to fail. On her deathbed, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren, Abigail clutched the locket Xavier had given her on their 20th anniversary. As her breathing slowed, her lips curved in a gentle smile. "He's waiting for me," she whispered to Sarah, who held her hand, "by the well." When she was laid to rest beside Xavier in Fairplay's cemetery, The headstone carried a simple engraving beneath their names and dates. He jumped in after her. The Lawrence Ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management and later his children's. The story of Xavier and Abigail passed from generation to generation, sometimes embellished, but always centered on one truth: that love, true love, will dive into the deepest waters to save what matters most. In 1983, 100 years after Xavier pulled Abigail from the well, their descendants gathered at the ranch for a family reunion. Great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and even a few great-great-great-grandchildren traveled from across the country to celebrate their shared heritage. During the celebration, 12-year-old Amy Lawrence, a direct descendant with Xavier's dark hair and Abigail's green eyes, discovered a hidden compartment in the old family desk. Inside lay a water-damaged journal written in Abigail's elegant hand, preserved by Xavier after her death. The final entry, dated just weeks before she passed, read, "As I near the end of my journey, I find myself thinking often of beginnings, of a well that should have been my end but instead became my beginning, of a brave cowboy who didn't hesitate to risk everything for a stranger. Love, I have learned, is not always the grand gestures celebrated in novels. Sometimes it is simply the courage to leap toward another soul without guarantee of safe landing. Xavier jumped for me that day, and every day since. And I, who could not swim, learned to navigate the waters of life with him by my side. If there is any wisdom I can leave to those who come after, it is this: when love calls you to jump into unknown depths, do not hesitate. The water may be cold, the descent frightening, but what awaits below could be the greatest adventure of your life." The journal became a treasured family heirloom, shared at weddings and celebrations as a reminder of the legacy of love that began with a well, a drowning schoolteacher, and the cowboy brave enough to jump in after her.